This week, Emmet is joined by Bobsy of the podcasts Shadow Trap and Diane, and sometimes a guest on the Silence podcast, to talk about Robert Kirkman's recently concluded series, The Walking Dead. What is the deeper meaning of the series? Was that meaning intentionally put there or subconsciously? First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. Deconstructing Comics earns a bit of money from your purchase that helps us keep the show going. We really appreciate your support.
This is Emmet.
And this is Bobsy.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Emmet in Melbourne with Bobsy in Brighton, who's our guest to discuss The Walking Dead, which has recently ended with issue 193. Bobsy, you may know from popular Twin Peaks podcast Diane, as well as the Shadow Trap, which I'm a big fan of, sort of folklore trap, folklore investigation as a podcast. And I approached Bobsy.
Yeah, we don't know what the hell we're doing with it.
It's very fun. I feel like
okay, that's the main thing.
I feel like you're sort of characters from a John Rossum comic that have straight into the real world almost, you know, like Midnight Mass or something like that.
Oh, okay, right, yeah. I'm not terribly familiar with all that stuff, but you're right. Like, people who have kind of stuck with a semi-supernatural problem and maybe making it more supernatural as they look at it.
Yeah, you're invoking
it feels like,
the supernatural.
Yeah, it feels like we maybe have. It feels like we maybe have made a terrible mistake because both of us have sort of lost a little bit of ontological grip on the world the more that we've started looking at these stories and entertaining the possibility that they might be more than merely stories. But anyway, go and listen to that. It's great fun. Thank you.
And I was just saying to Bobsy before we started recording that I had heard him talk about an issue of The Walking Dead on Silence, which is another comics podcast, and that's where I had the idea to ask him to come on here after I'd read the final issue. So welcome, Bobsy. Thanks for agreeing to do this.
Thank you for having me, Emmet. Lovely to be here.
I should also mention that Patreon supporters of Diane get to see your Invisibles series where you do. This show is called Deconstructing Comics, but I feel what you're doing with the Invisibles is deconstruction on a whole other level, because I was just watching your most recent episode and I think 20 minutes in you'd got to the third panel or the first page.
It gets quite intense. Again, similar to the Shadow Trap, and in fact to Diane. I mean, maybe this is just a side effect of podcasting, or certainly the way I do it. But you can really unhook a few things that you didn't know were there just by sitting and kind of free associating about it a little bit. And I'm an old Grant Morrison fanboy from way back, as anybody who's heard me on Silence or whatever would know. But actually going back and looking at the Invisibles again has really shooken me. Actually, there's so much in there that kind of relates to the world that I grew up in and the kind of person that I became just through the damage of reading too many bloody comics. That it's quite a thing. It's like I don't really know what purpose I'm doing it for anymore, but I feel like I'm absolutely powerless to stop. So yeah, long may it continue. It's only $1 if you sign up to the Diane Patreon. So yeah, come and listen to me lose my mind month by month on that.
Very good. Well, I feel The Walking Dead is almost a palate cleanser after The Invisibles, because that is nothing but, it's hyper referential. Like, every issue is packed with all these asides and little allusions to source material that can send you down all sorts of rabbit holes, whereas The Walking Dead always struck me as a very, what's the term, arrearist type series. This sort of early 2000s, let's bring back the George Romero zombie, let's bring back the shambling zombie, let's get away from running zombies from 28 Days Later. As a comic book, I also felt The Walking Dead was very filmic. It seemed to be more inspired by films than comics. I had a sort of sense of this classic zombie tale unfolding slowly month to month, but it was stunningly successful. It was a huge hit for Image. It was a black and white comic that lasted until 2019, sort of a reminder of what the 90s independent scene was like with all black and white comics, and followed a set of principal characters throughout these years, consistently telling their stories. I'm interested to know why it was so successful, as I said to you before we started recording. But last month, unexpectedly, with issue 193, it ended. And that was it. There was no grand conclusion beyond, and then they stopped.
I mean, that feels almost it's kind of like it's either like a kind of just one of those things, right? It's just a side effect of comics being comics, and for everybody's best laid plan ultimately is dependent on just, circumstances, economics, whether you got bored of it, whether you got busy doing something else. And The Walking Dead kind of like won me back a little bit by throwing in that kind of surprise end, just because it made it feel much less kind of deliberate and constructed. It made it feel a bit more organic, if you like, a bit more prone to the haphazard nature of comics production more generally. And also it just works as a great surprise. It's always good to pull a trick on the readership. It's always good to it was good to stop rather than just keep going. I'm sure there are plenty of arguments to be made that, The Walking Dead could have stopped 50 issues ago, and that would have been fine too. There's plenty of people who would argue, I'm sure, that there was another 50 issues left in it that they could have gone forward with. But to pull a big surprise out of the bag like that, to avoid the kind of circus of hype that a big it's the final issue process and build up to that kind of big story shape would necessitate in most other kind of big name franchise books, to not do all that. Kind of won me over again a little bit.
And in the afterword for the issue, Kirkman himself, so it's Kirkman and Charlie Adlard on the final issue, and Adlard has been consistently with the book since, I think, 9 or 10
the
issues
fourth
in.
issue or something? Oh, is it as many as that? Okay.
I think Terry Moore was on for a while, but you might be you might be right, because I remember he was very early. There was a change. It was this sudden abrupt change to a new artist and a new style, and then you just got used to it because Terry Moore was quite different. But in this afterward, Rickman thanks Adlard, thanks the people who realized the television series. This, of course, has gone on to become a television series, video games, a bunch of video games. The television series itself has had now 2 and counting spin-offs. The Walking Dead was something of an empire. And it's almost as if the comic book that spawned all this is a husk that's been left behind. And now it's loosed on the world, and now we've just got this thing that's in the background. And go, oh yeah, we used to be a thing, but now we're not.
So is the TV? I don't want to talk too much about the TV show because
Sure.
I definitely haven't watched it. But is it still a thing? I remember a few years ago, and not that long ago, 3 years ago, 2-3 years ago maybe, it being enormous. Kind of like the only thing that was almost big enough to challenge Game of Thrones. And then it seemed to overbalance itself with these spin-off shows. It seems to seem to believe its hype a bit too much, but, overestimate its own fundamental appeal. And then, as far as I'm aware, there hasn't been any new seasons, or there's been millions and I just haven't been paying attention at all. And it just kind of retreated into its no doubt significant niche, but stop kind of troubling the wider cultural conversation, if you like. But it's still going, I guess.
Yeah, I listened to an old podcast I recorded for a network back in 2012, and
Wow.
I was talking to a few American lads who were zombie filmmakers and all about the Walking Dead series. I think it was the second series of the show, and they were just complaining about the quality of the show, about how bad it was. And even back then, I feel as if it was a show that people loved to hate.
Right.
There was a lot of people compulsively watching, but then going online to complain about it. And it's almost as if in the last year or so, people have stopped even doing that. Like, you don't have that same intensity of feeling.
Right.
But apparently, critically, the show is doing much better.
Right.
They've had a cleaning of the house, and they've got new people behind the cameras, and they've done this time jump in the show, and all the principal cast are moving on, and they've gone completely off book, and seemingly that has given the show a new license that it didn't have before. So apparently I have not watched it myself, so we don't need to go down that path.
Good man.
But there's so much to do.
I know, it's a busy life, yeah.
But I haven't gone near it, and part of that was because I was just exhausted by it, and I want to get into this with The Walking Dead itself. I kind of feel as if the premise of The Walking Dead, the comic, is this search for safety when the heroes are surrounded by zombies who are pursuing them. And I can get behind that to an extent, but it felt to me as if the comic's understanding of what safety is and my understanding of what safety and survival is are two very, very different things. And with the last issue, that sense of the status quo being brought back, so we have a president, we have a Supreme Court, which is now one person who can just dispense with justice summarily.
Is it Michonne as well? Is it?
Yes, Michonne is the Supreme Court. Yeah.
So she basically she finds you guilty and then chops your head off with her katana at the as you get dragged away. I like that.
Well, interestingly, Carl, who is Rick Grimes' son, and Rick Grimes is now long dead. Spoilers, sorry. But if you're listening to this podcast, well, tough luck.
Yeah.
Rick Grimes has been dead for some time, and now he's this sainted icon. And everybody talks about him with such reverence. So he's become almost like the founders of the American Constitution, this sort of sense of this enshrined rule of law personified in a human being that everyone just follows. And I found it immensely disturbing that the vision of a post-apocalyptic, post-zombie devastation is to let's just bring back everything that we had before and reinstill it. And this is a good ending. This is what they want. And that, really alienating to me.
This is the okay. So I hate The Walking Dead, right? I really want to make that clear up front. I absolutely loathe it. I think it's a bad thing for the world, and I think for kind of the reason that you just said, pretty much. But that doesn't mean it's not without its pleasures. It doesn't mean that it's not a good comic book in loads of ways. And in the preparation for this chat, I've been, I read a bunch of the books, and I found myself hating myself for how much I was enjoying the actual experience of reading it, how much there is to say about it as a comic book, as a constructed set of objects. But the tone and the thing you've described, the meaning of it, the purpose of it, has always been terrifying to me. The way that it took this, it's obviously like a 21st century piece of fiction. It happens shortly after 9/11. The financial crisis happens, along 5 years into its run, and it's been regularly produced. It always kept to a really steady schedule. So 5 years was 5 years. That was 60 issues or so. It's been with us throughout this incredibly tumultuous period of Western American history, and all it's had to say is, dear God, we need to let the cops back in charge. Yes. We need to construct a world which is as much like the old one as we can make it, but with the added sort of sense of emergency that the zombies give. So it's the Constitution, if you like, and the rule of law and so many accepted ways of doing things, we can suspend them because we do have this constant threat, which is real. It's not a constructed threat of terrorists thousands of miles away. It's actual zombies on our doorstep right now. And it gives us license to create and recreate society in this terrible prepper Wild West vision of what society could be like if we started again. And all it's ever had to say is, you've got to love Rick. It's just invested so much, like you say, in this sainted icon of a man who basically is just, a cross between a cop and a really annoying head teacher. I've always found it really, really unsettling and frightening that this was the best vision of what the world that we rebuild could be, is. And that for that, I hated it. I absolutely loathed it, with all the caveats about it being a good thing, comic-wise. So I agree. And the way that it ended with this literal statue of Rick, kind of, holding his stumpy hand aloft, I found troubling. Insofar as the comic always had this weird obsession with him as a central character. There was a point, I guess, when his wife and child are killed quite early on.
Yes.
In the prison set, so that would have been about issue 20 or something, I suppose, where you've got this cool idea, and it's the Game of Thrones thing of anyone can die. And then quickly you realise, except Rick. And even though the comic has this weird flirtation with his mortality, the way it keeps mutilating his body and trying to pile suffering into him without ever removing him. Becomes like it almost becomes like a joke within the fabric of the comic. It almost becomes the way you really feel that the authors have got this huge blind spot around the character of Rick, that they're trying so hard to make you love this guy. They don't realize how infatuated they are with him, and it makes it it kind of creates this kind of unintentional sort of bathos in there, which is one of the things that keeps me reading, actually. It's one of the things that I look for, is when is Rick's next speech where suddenly his mistakes are justified again? Where is the comic going to probe his weaknesses and then thoroughly come down on his side once more, while making you think, wow, what a great guy, good old Rick.
And it's his implicit authority in what he represents, which is this white savior who happens to be a cop. That the comic is telling us, this is good. This is what a good is. And any alternative vision of society, or the kind of society, never succeeds in the comic. And they will turn out to be cannibals or something.
And that's or to dress up as zombie. Yeah, okay, we'll get to the Whisperers in a bit, I guess. But
yes.
It's so, as the comic has been being told, it's so counter to all of the sensibleness that has been emerging in the outside world of okay, so the problem actually is racist cops. The problem actually is these toxic masculine structures which are failing to let go without dragging everyone down with them. And yet The Walking Dead keeps rising up and saying, no, it's, what you need is John Wayne with a beard, and that'll make everything right again. The way that it treats women as being only useful insofar as they shed their femininity, the way except for the women who you don't see, right? So you've got the hero women like oh dear, I can't remember her name. His wife Andrea, is it? And Maggie. They're allowed to be cool insofar as they are tough, insofar as they're good with guns. And then you have this kind of this other unseen sort of population of women characters who presumably are mending everybody's clothes and doing the cooking and doing all of that survival horror stuff, which you never see because it's dramatically boring. Even though I don't think it is dramatically boring. I think whenever this world building stuff is happening, I'm always really interested in okay, where are they getting the needle and thread from? Where are they getting? And The Walking Dead does do
what you're describing there is essential uninterest. He's not interested in women. He's not interested in how women talk.
Oh, goodness me, no.
That's the maddening thing.
Yeah, he's not interested in how anyone talks. He's only interested in how dudes give big speeches. and use those speeches to justify their weirdly irrational and violent decisions. The the rule of violence, whether it's violence against the zombies, whether it's violence against like carceral violence against the human enemies that they have, whether it's violence in kind of corporal terms. There's a scene I read this week where a guy on horseback, one of the guards of the Alexandria community, misses his patrol, basically, kind of, he doesn't spot a zombie that gets onto the road, and Rick properly like beats him with a stick, and he's like, "I'm sorry, Mr. Grimes, I'm sorry," and he's like, "You risk everything by refusing your duty or by letting one zombie through," and it was just a mistake, the guy just happened to miss a zombie, and Rick beats him quite savagely with a stick in front of his son, and it's like, fine. It's like, yeah, that's just how it, Rick's got to do this. Rick's violence is entirely justified because what if a zombie gets in, man? And it creates this kind of, it creates this false object of terror, right? Like, as long as, if you have zombies there, you can justify any form of violent excess because there's so much at stake. But I'm afraid the real world isn't like that unless you make it like that. So it feels like, and what The Walking Dead does is it makes it like that. It creates a self-justifying narrative structure, narrative universe, which is so sort of partial and so sort of reliant on maintaining its own internal contradictions that the storytelling space ultimately starts to feel constrictive and boring. Like you can read. One of the great things about The Walking Dead is Charlie Adlard's art and its consistency and its readability and the way that you can slide into a huge chunk of this stuff. Read it, enjoy it. The path into the comic is always very easy. The reading experience is very immersive. But then suddenly. And it's not sudden. It takes, it can take hundreds of pages of the stuff, quite honestly, before you kind of notice. You're in this empty narrative space. You suddenly realize that there's nothing in there that's actually kind of deserving of your interest. And you realize that you've been following the same dramatic beats, yeah? So you have the small panels, the big splash page, the small panels, the big splash page. It only uses that rhythm, which can get quite hypnotic. But as soon as you start to realize, as soon as you spot the edges of it, or I become really alienated from the comic really quickly, and I kind of throw it down almost. And then sometime later I go and pick it up again, like an idiot.
I have tried those major compendiums, which apparently are very successful commercially. People like buying the big shelf-stopper Walking Dead volume. And
right.
I find them exhausting to read for that reason. The repetition and the rhythm becomes very, very clear. And people have talked about, and I've read complaints about the series that, they will find a place, it'll be safe, they'll set up shop, and then something will go wrong, and they'll have to leave, and they'll find another place, and, which I think is true, but something you said there as well. In my notes, I'd written down heroism equals capacity for violence. Like, that's what makes a hero in this story, is your capacity for violence. And my other note was, like, when you hunt a vampire or when you hunt a werewolf, you need a specialist. You need somebody who's trained in the behavior of a vampire or a werewolf and has special tools. Whereas if you want to kill a zombie, any schlub can kill a zombie. It's just headshot.
You just need a spade, cricket bat, yeah.
Yeah. And as you're saying, in the post 9/11 context of this comic's commercial success, that became increasingly disturbing for me because it seemed to be justifying the outward, in the real world, militarization of society. Because in this comic, it's like, well, zombies are acceptable people to kill. That's basically what zombies are in this comic book. They're people you can kill without consequence. Because they're not people, they're unpeople. And I feel like that's leaking into the world in a way, in that there is a mindset out there there are unpeople out there. There are people you can kill, and no consequences should be had. and that the last issue of this series is all about Carl Grimes feeling hard done by because he's killed a zombie, and he's told by society, this new society that which is represented by a woman, a half Asian man,
Right.
telling him, you don't get to do whatever you want anymore. And the comic is telling us, the reader, they're wrong. Carl should kill the zombie. You know?
Yeah. Because
the
because
natural
it's a
order
zombie.
has
I'm
been
like, what the
turned
hell?
upside down. Sorry, yeah.
But no, by women and minorities and
Yeah.
bloody laws getting in the way of things, of me having my fun. Right, okay, I wasn't aware that was like I saw that Carl killed like a like a sideshow zombie or something, and
Yes.
or like a snake oil salesman's traveling zombie parade.
Yes. So that's
And,
Herschel. So Herschel is the son of the president of the United States in this world, who is Maggie. So it's Maggie's son, and he's grown up to be a spoilt brat, and he never really experienced the world that his parents, Glenn and Maggie, had to live through, and as a result, he
had to get their brains bashed in for.
Yeah, and he's trying to recapture some of that excitement, that adrenaline rush, by exhibiting zombies in an entertainment. And the idea is that Carl just won't brook that. He's like, no, this is a threat to my family. My family's in danger. Did you see that meme that went out? I don't know when this podcast will go live. Did you see that meme on the weekend about 30 to 50 feral hogs? And that's why I need an assault rifle.
Yes, yeah, no, I even read that. Yeah, it's not dissimilar, is it? Although I did read worryingly that 30 and 50 are like, Nazi call signs or something.
It's Nazi. Yeah, there's a theory
And
going
the reason
around
that guy was obviously signaling. Yeah, anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's similar, right? It's that justification for violence in your backyard by
exactly.
because there is an other that exists to be exterminated.
Yes, and the tragedy of 193, we're being told, is that the swords are being turned into plowshares. The way of the warrior, the way of Rick Grimes, has to be buried, and now we have this new society. But Carl's going to keep the spirit of Rick Grimes alive by telling his daughter the story about his father, the hero, who, as you said, beat a man for a simple mistake.
Yeah, and constantly does things which endanger the community, and justifies it through further violence and through the comment. And this is this kind of like the manufactured synthetic nature of this is really what kind of annoys me. Like, the comic just keeps telling you he's right and giving him opportunities to say that he's right, and throwing these weak arguments against him, and the consequences of his actions are always ones which prove him to be right, and it's all just it's all just so manufactured feeling, like Negan, right? Yeah. The kind of the, like, you have various, there are various like baddies throughout the swing of the book. You have the governor, who's obviously like a relic of the previous order and deeply corrupt and perverse. And then you have at the other end you have Alpha, who is kind of like the progenitor of this kind of new form of social madness, whereby humans try to become zombies. And in the middle between them, you have Negan, who is kind of like a dark side Rick. It's like, what if Rick was basically the same, but it was bad, rather than him being like he is and it being good. And the distinction between the goodness and badness that they share is completely arbitrary, just completely manufactured by the comic. And the only kind of sign of corruption that we get for Negan is that he enjoys. He's kind of sexually provocative in a way which Rick isn't, and and he kills in cold blood, which Rick only does when no one's looking, kind of thing, But the comic doesn't ever. The comic doesn't do what it's purporting to do, which is show you that Negan's bad, because Negan comes into the book like a kind of a girlfriend who, when you're getting bored with your wife, you hook up with Negan, right? And just at the point where the comic feels like its love affair with Rick is maybe hitting an impasse, it goes, what about Negan? And although Negan is created as this villain structure, like any villain, in a comic book at least, any comic book villain, the comic doesn't realize how much in love it is with this bad thing that it's created. Like when Negan comes along, it's like this breath of fresh air. He's given all of the best lines. He's drawn in a way which makes him jump out of the panel more than any of the other characters around him. His depravity is so enjoyable for the reader, right? Love to hate is kind of is a trite thing to say, but like there's a difference between loving to hate and a comic kind of, or a narrative accidentally over investing in a position which it thought it was going to be critical of and ending up just manufacturing joy with it, and keeping the reader alive through this image of Negan. And that kind of a manifestation of violence within the text itself just serves to reorient. It just serves to kind of spice things up. It doesn't provide any kind of critique of Rick's methods. It just gives Rick something else to prove that he's better than by refusing to kind of give in to the like I say, the sexual corruption and the specific forms of violence that Negan prefers over the specific forms of violence that Rick prefers. He would rather, after Negan gets like defeated, he's like a run.
Yeah, you've just given me an idea for a point of contrast, which is you mentioned Grant Morrison and the Invisibles earlier on. We touched on that quickly, but you've reminded me in terms of villains of the Brotherhood of Data from Doom Patrol, where you have these villains enter the comic and clearly be a source of greater interest to the creators than the principal characters. The Brotherhood of Data are much more interesting, and not only are they more interesting, not only do they have this interest for the creators, but they interrupt the flow of the story and they completely subvert what we're reading, because the expectation is the hero stops the villain. And Doom Patrol asks the question, well, what if we want the villain to win? Because they've got a point. And the Brotherhood of Data, I mean, Mr. Nobody is proved right in the end, because Doom Patrol is ultimately failed and betrayed by everyone around them. They are an experiment, a sadistic experiment that have been unleashed, and they're not a superhero team. They're freaks and the abused, and the Brotherhood of Data are like going, well, let's just change reality because this sucks.
Yeah, like jump on the bus, guys. Like, let's have some fun here. Yeah. And the other thing it does is the same when Negan turns up. It actually completely enlivens the experience of the comic. Like those Brotherhood of Dada issues are among the best remembered issues of that run, because suddenly when they're around, the comics actually it's a great run. There's very little. Well, it's a great run. But those issues are a high point in it, because it's like, well, this comic's just great now. This is just fun to have these guys around, and the creators and the kind of the premise of the comic itself bends in towards them. It leans towards them, because there's this jouissance in there, if you like, that makes the experience of reading what it is, and does subvert its own meaning and its own point. And I think Morrison does that deliberately. I think Kirkman does it. Or at least I hope Morrison does it deliberately. I think Kirkman does it subconsciously. I think there's psychiatrist's couch mess leaking all over The Walking Dead, right? You're like, what kind of a man would make this? What are his dreams like? What are his wishes like? And if creating like a zombie empire, zombie TV show Empire is his ambition, then great, he's got it. But if it's actually to create a narrative didactic kind of point, and it is that because The Walking Dead is nothing if not lecturing you, then the point that he was trying to make was kind of a bit shit to start with, and has become, through the telling, really it's just really lost its way. It's just really warped and a bit and very easy from the outside to look at and go, no, mate, this isn't it.
Coming up, is the character of Negan funny? How did the success of the Walking Dead TV show affect the comic? Should Kirkman have gone with his original idea for the ending? First, thanks to all our patrons at patreon.com/deconcomics, more classic episodes of Deconstructing Comics have been unlocked, and I'm releasing them at the rate of one per week in reverse order. This week I'll be republishing episode 93 from September 17th, 2007, in which Mulele and I discuss violence in comics. What's acceptable? What's necessary? The classic episodes can be found on our Facebook and Twitter feeds, by clicking on the earliest months listed on the left sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com, or in publicly available posts on our Patreon page. Check out all our goals and help us reach them at patreon.com/deconcomics. When you watched Batman as a kid, you enjoyed the colorful heroes and villains, the text sound effects on the screen, the thrill of watching a heroic crime fighter escaping from death traps and taking down bad guys. But the show was devised to interest adults, too. What did you miss as a kid? Sexual innuendo.
The penguin's too small for me.
Closeted gay characters.
I like that cape, Batman.
Freudian death traps.
Has the giant clam really swallowed Robin?
Police incompetence.
Bruce Wayne is a millionaire playboy. Hardly a secret identity for Batman.
Whether you're a kid or an adult, there's something to like about our favorite Caped Crusader. Tim and Paul dig for the deeper meanings under the Batmania every other Thursday. What's the podcast's name?
To the Batpoles. To the Batpoles. To the Batpoles.
And when we started speaking, I made a sort of conscious note to myself, don't raise Negan. Don't mention Negan. Let's just see how far we can get into this without mentioning Negan. Because I'm not having a go, but because almost every review I've read of The Walking Dead over the years, people will talk about how funny he is, how great he is. Oh, he's such a good time. I love whenever Negan's in the comic, and I never found him that. Personally, I didn't find him that engaging. But I reread the Whisperer War, which is like the last big hurrah of the series. It's the last epic burst of storytelling from Adlard and Kirkman, and I say Adlard as well, not just in terms of the collaboration between them, but because you have the paneling becomes frenetic in the Whisperer War, and to a weird degree. But
that's actually the point where the dull rhythm that we were talking about beforehand, they do, like Adlard at least seems to make a conscious effort to break that. Doesn't he? Like that's quite clearly happening during that sequence. Yeah.
Let's just smash it and see what happens. It's almost experimental in some points, but that's the run where you have an extended speech from Negan all about having sex with someone's feet.
What really?
Yeah, he gives a speech about it, and then it's supposedly his way of de-escalating some tension between the two rival forces that he's in between. But it's just an excuse for Kirkman's script to have this character say all these outre things, these objectionable things. He says fuck a lot. That's basically the whole thing about Negan. That's what makes him funny. He swears an awful lot. And then he talks about having sex with a woman's feet. And then when everyone's shocked into silence by this statement, he goes, oh, come on. You're saying no one else has ever thought of doing this, and again, it's a clanger. It's this sequence.
So weird, isn't it?
It's meant to be funny.
What is it about? It's Tarantino, isn't it? What is it about dudes who
I don't know.
write their characters swearing a lot and feet? It's
it's weird.
It's a thing, isn't it? Earthiness. I don't know.
Yeah, there's
but you're right in thinking that about like. I mean, I don't know. I guess maybe I disagree with you, but like, it feels like Negan becomes the point of the comic all of the time. There is so much of the comic's kind of interest is invested in him. I mean, that's why people talk about him all the time, because he is written and like I say, drawn in a way which makes him bounce out of the comic in a way which none of the other characters do. Because and it doesn't have an answer for his exuberance. It just locks it up in the prison, and Rick kind of derives his own. He just indulges his sadism, basically. He just likes to go and watch Negan squirm. Whereas Negan would have killed Rick and got over it and got on with his life. Rick likes to keep his dirty little secret in the basement and poke at it.
Yeah, it's the Superman problem, where Rick is the kind, because Rick has to be this moral authority. Rick can't move the story along by doing anything objectionable. He can't. Even the example you gave before of the beating of the soldier, well, he's exercising authority. That's good. Superman equally is just good. Negan is like a 1990s anti-villain. He just does things because they're funny for him to do, and that's what creators had to resort to move these stories forward, because you can't tarnish Superman by having him doing something bad, which of course is very silly, because if Superman is good, then he would change society because he'd want to make things better. Then you can tell some really interesting stories, but he can't do that either. So he's sort of frozen. And Rick's similar in that way. He can't do anything that would threaten the iconic martyrdom that is coming his way in issue 192, 191.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's almost the thing, isn't it? Is like it's like when the rapture happens, it's okay because maybe you will be a saint, right? It's like maybe you will, and actually you can fight your way into becoming a saint. You don't have to forgive anyone. You don't have to kind of look deep within yourself. You can just turn outward forcefully, and it's kind of salvation, historic salvation will come to you. That's kind of the other point, right? Isn't it? Is that like and sorry to get meta on you, but like the narrative, as soon as the first, I don't know what, 60 issues are over, interestingly about the point where the other apocalypse happens, right? So you have the 9/11 apocalypse happening a couple of years before, or let's say you have the Iraq apocalypse happening just as The Walking Dead starts to come out, 2003. In 2008, that's when the financial crash happens. That's your next apocalypse. That's the point at which the story has had its initial burst of energy, and now is beginning to think, okay, what do we do next? And you get this series you get them building out of the Alexandria complex into the other communities. And it really feels like every time, it feels like the story itself, right? It's trying to find a stable status quo for itself, which doesn't bore you. And rather than go, well, we could have some more zombies, which is always a bit fun. It keeps trying to find its new path by finding alternative types of community and showing you why they're not as good as Rick's, which, as I've said, is partial, is entirely weighted towards Rick's just because that's the weird ass society of like violence plus a framework that does anything it can to build itself around that violence that you can have. Whereas, so it gives you Negan, which is kind of a violence that doesn't have that kind of perverse constriction working against it, which is part of what the comic loves as well. You know, it loves to have the rules, and then it loves to break them, but then have the rules kind of constrict you again. Whereas Negan won't have that, and the story really struggles to generate interest for itself, and throws up these weird, and eventually it throws up that weird aberration of the Whisperers, which is it's kind of its most fantastical sort of extrusion, and also the point, as you said, where the narrative has, not the narrative, but the storytelling techniques have to change to continue to be interesting and to keep it interesting for the artist. I would think it feels like that's the point where Adlard is going, I'm not drawing another 9-panel page or another 6-panel page actually. Can we do something interesting here? I'll stay up late. I need to get out of this rut. I don't mind doing these crazy pages as long as something happens. And I guess it's really interesting to speculate on whether after that point they all just went, dude, we've got to start doing this comic, and then pull the big ending out of, not the big ending, sorry, the small ending out of the thin air eventually, or whether they had a concept of where this should have ended already, or how they wanted it to end. And I kind of think that maybe they didn't. That maybe it was all just, let's break the story until we can't break it anymore, and then everyone's bored of it, and let's see where it goes. They broke it so much that it had to mutate into TV shows and video games, which is kind of, is the other kind of malaise of the era that it's grown up in, is the way that comics themselves have been ransacked for other modes of value.
Well,
And
I have a suspicion about this, and yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, I agree with you that comics are basically IP farms now for different media, but this lull that you're talking about, this sort of period of storytelling steadiness, I wonder if that was because in 2010 it must have been, you had the success of the television series, and that's where the comic now can't really break too much, because you want it to continue long enough to support and prop up and whatever the sort of transmedia concerns of the television series.
You're absolutely right. That's probably exactly what it is, isn't it? Is that suddenly there are concerns far bigger than whether Image has got a hit book on its hand. And I have a huge amount of sympathy for creators who find themselves in that impasse, because obviously it's the realization of their ambitions, or not their ambitions artistically necessarily, but it's like, well, this is great. This means I don't have to worry about money so much anymore. But there's also this responsibility of you become a business owner rather than an artist, which must be awful to have, suddenly to have actors and special effects guys and cameramen and location scouts and key grips and best boys all relying on your story engine to kind of keep them in jobs.
Well, I feel like Garth Ennis must be the luckiest man in that he's got 2 adaptations of his comics out there now, The Boys and Preacher, and his work on these 2 books is long concluded. So it's almost as if he's gone to them, oh yeah, lads, take your shot, go for it. I'm done. I don't have that pressure. I've said what I wanted to say with these stories.
Yeah. I mean, indeed, to just be like, well, there you go, it's all on the shelf.
Yeah.
Help yourself. Yeah, rather than actually having to adapt it into an ongoing process of creation, which must have been, like you say, must have been the point at which the comic itself started to shake quite. And when I say shake, I mean stagnate quite badly.
But you mentioned endings, and I quickly wanted to read something from Kirkman's Afterward.
Okay.
And this is the bit I, after reading the issue and after, as we talked about the sort of emotional response to issue 193, I read his Afterward, and I did expect it to be sort of, thanks everyone for reading. It's very emotional. Sincere thanks to everyone for your fans, all that kind of stuff, right? And instead,
all the haters, all the losers.
You're not far off.
Excellent.
I would recommend you read the Afterward, and I recommend anybody listening to, because it's very odd. It's, hey, aren't you surprised by that? Look at what we did. This was always the plan, to really shock you with this. We really pulled out of We pulled it out this time, you know. And then he gets this bit, and this is where he pitches the original ending that he'd envisioned. So he talks about Rick gives a speech. And we close.
What?
Yes, there's a speech. And then we close up on Rick's face. You turn the page, and Rick is the same, only it's a statue. We zoom out from the statue with vines growing on the bottom of the statue, cracks forming. And I'm going to read now. And you realize that it was quite old. We keep zooming out until we saw that the statue was in Alexandria, the same place where he gave the speech. But it was different. It was old and run down. Broken windows and missing doors. We would keep zooming out until a zombie walked by, then another, and we'd see that Rick had brought them to Alexandria, given his grand speech about rebuilding society, and succeeded to the point that he'd built a statue to honor him. But in the end, the dead won, society crumbled again, this time seemingly for good, and that was it. It was a terrible ending, bleak, sad, made the whole story pointless. What can I say? I was young, and most of the endings I wrote or came up with back then were pretty bleak. So that ending, in hindsight, was embarrassingly bad, but more than that, I wasn't ready to end this series, not by a long shot. And he goes on to explain how he arrived at the finished ending. But here's my thing. I like that ending. I like that ending a lot. And I'm not that young anymore, Bobsy.
None of us are, mate.
But I like that ending. It's like I think when I wrote to you first, I said I feel like it's become shit kicker Canticle for Leibowitz, by which I mean Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter Miller had this sort of cyclic idea of history, that there would be this apocalypse and then society would rebuild, and there would be another apocalypse and then society would rebuild. And I like that idea. There's a pessimism to it, there's a fatalism to it, but it's a nice ending. And he seemed to have arrived at that. That's where the story was driving him. And then he's going, no, this is bad. And again, I wonder if it's the commercial pressure. You can't end it in a miserable way. But then, if we look at something like Game of Thrones, which ended recently, and everyone expected the cast to be killed off, and then everyone more or less survives, and people were furious. So
yeah, with the happy ending, yeah.
Yeah, if the story is leading you to this conclusion that society will end because death is inevitable, and you're writing a zombie comic, that makes perfect sense. Like, that's what the zombie is.
I wonder, is there so that pessimism, that those bleak endings, that is a mark of the genre, isn't it? That's Romero's kind of thing. And so I can imagine that there might be a wish to not do that, because that is kind of the thing that's coming. On the other hand, there's a reason that that's the suitable ending for the genre, is because it's the suitable ending for the genre. It's like, are you telling a story about death or are you telling a story about life? And I think The Walking Dead kind of didn't know which, and kind of chose life. Sorry, I sound like Ewan McGregor. It chose life in the end, when actually I agree with you. Basically, I think the trend of the story is to take you down. I think Romero probably would have liked to have given his stories a happy ending, and then realised how trite that seemed, and how what the last panel is basically Carl reading a bedtime story to his daughter, right? Like, that's a shit ending. It's like that's as cliched and banal. I mean, people worry about endings a bit too much, in my opinion. It's a bit like, by the time you've got to the ending, it's just you've just got to stop. It's like the idea that you're going to be able to sum up 15 years of labour in a way which kind of is right and meets both the ambitions that you had at the start and the conclusions that you've drawn subsequently. I think, especially in a piece of serial drama, which is always going to have to be open-ended a little bit, I think people worry about it too much. But you should always let the you should always let the zombie win.
The zombie is death. I mean, it's inevitable. That's why he's there. It's there. Sorry, the big other that we're all approaching, and. I was reading something today where they're saying the thing about death is we all know it's coming, but we don't think about it all the time, because if you would, you'd go mad. So that's why the zombie is this sort of very violent interruption, because it's like, oh shit, there's death. It's right there.
Yeah, again, yeah. Let's build a wall. Oh, that hasn't worked either.
Yeah.
When you said Canticle for Leibowitz, it made me think of I think in any kind of discussion about The Walking Dead as a comic, and certainly as its influence on comics and on indie book publishing in the 21st century, I think you should mention Crossed as well. Because
look, I wasn't going. You know what? I was going to, but again, I've written about Crossed a lot, and I'm kind of concerned people are going to be worried about me. But
yeah, fair enough. It is a worrying piece. Yeah.
Let's touch on Crossed.
Yeah. Okay. Well, because it does the other problem that Romero throws up and kind of catches himself in is the obvious fun of the zombie apocalypse, and that's what the second Romero's film is about, right? Is about the zombie apocalypse creates a consumer paradise, and you have everything you've ever wanted, and it's great. That joy there again becomes a problem that you have to confront. Crossed is basically another zombie comic. It arose in exactly the same conditions as The Walking Dead, but it's just very different. It's radically different, and goes out of its way to confront that question of dystopia isn't utopia in disguise. It's just dystopia. Everything about it is scary, and everyone is either damaged by the trauma of the apocalypse, or the survivors, or they're a monster themselves initially. That was kind of Garth Ennis's key insight, was that if you survive the apocalypse, you're probably a psychopath too. And that flips the rapture narrative on its head rather neatly.
Yes.
What Alan Moore then goes on to do in his kind of conclusion to Crossed is go, okay, if you bear with life for long enough, which involves bearing with death too, of course, it's only the intelligent people are left, and you let them craft a society which is, in that Canticle for Leibowitz sense, it has a depth, and it has an awareness of its contingency, which creates a new kind of consciousness in people, if you like. And then obviously, like the great kind of pessimistic twist is, what if death gets smart too? Yeah. What if the zombie what if death takes on a new form? And that seems to be the bit that The Walking Dead misses, is that what if, as life evolves, death evolves too. And there's a twist waiting there for you, and you can't see what it is. And the idea that you can figure it down to a zombie, as much as we might like them, and as much as we might be familiar with them, and as much as we might like playing with the tropes of it and seeing them spun back at us in a new and interesting way, or in a not new and interesting way, as it may be, it's not enough. The catastrophe does get cozy again, and you need to reckon with that. And that's maybe the thing that The Walking Dead kind of in either of the endings that Kirkman suggests there, neither of those are quite sufficient, because none of them sort of go, all right, space zombies, or what are the new forms of threat that we have to deal with now? And actually, new forms of threat that we do have to deal with don't necessarily figure the zombie terribly well. They're more, I don't know. This is why ghosts kind of replaced zombies in the noughties. Sorry, not the noughties. In this decade, in the teens, right? Not ghosts, but demons, perhaps.
Formless entities that are malign. They're all around us, and you can't see them, but they can influence you.
precisely. Very well said. Thank you. Yeah. Which is maybe why The Walking Dead had to end, and maybe maybe it was aware of its own having exhausted itself.
Yeah. On Crossed again, I won't go too deep, but I remember an interview with Garth Ennis, and he talked about where the idea came from. Mm-hmm. And you were saying a few minutes ago about Kirkman, like what kind of mind can produce this? What's the the couch psychologist's assessment of Kirkman from this corpus of work? Like what kind of person thinks of this vision of a post-apocalypse and goes, let's restore order exactly the same as it was before? What's that saying? Which of course is in this vision a police state. That's how it should be. So Ennis tells this story where he was sleeping in a friend's house and he had a nightmare, and in the nightmare he's in the house and there are zombies outside the house and they're converging and there's no way out and he's going to die. And that was the nightmare. And if you read Crossed, the feeling is that sort of nightmare logic. Whatever you do, it's going to go wrong. No matter what you do, you can't escape. And that sense of dread that you have when you're almost half conscious in the dream state, that a bad ending's coming. Even though in the plot of the dream that you're in, the ending isn't arrived yet. But this sense, I'm doomed. That nightmare thinking, he channeled that into Crossed. And it's such a devastating read and really horrifying. And then the real twist of the knife is that Ennis, and I think Moore as well, and Spurrier too, I'd like to mention him.
Sure.
They give you these little moments of hope. These
little
moments of relief. And that's when it's devastating.
That's you're right. It's terrifying, and it feels a little bit like where we might be. A bit, I don't want to be one of those guys who kind of goes, who kind of there's a terrible kind of intellectual trend currently, isn't there? Like, unless you are a pessimist, you're not being a grown up. You're not being sensible. But that does appear to be the plough that Crossed furrows terribly well, or the furrow that it ploughs. I'm never sure which way around that should go. Is that kind of like, what if we as an us have gone to the point where there isn't an option other than doom? And The Walking Dead kind of seems to know that. Seems to go, well, like you just said, the best you've got is a police state, and it's like, well, that's not good enough. That's just another form of doom. And I think the reason that Crossed is like a better book, a more useful book in many ways, a more kind of positive book, if you like, because it does it encourages us to sort of dredge for better possibilities, which The Walking Dead kind of doesn't. It pushes us back into old ones. That's maybe why Crossed is not a successful book, but a more potent and useful book to us right now.
And in terms of, at the beginning of this conversation, I asked you, could we maybe try and unpack what's the source of The Walking Dead's popularity? I think you just identified it, which is that The Walking Dead almost winks at the reader to say, well, in the event of a police state, you'll be on the right side of the wall. You're right. You're good. You're reading this.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Oh my goodness, it does. Yes. No, actually, I said that. I've actually made a note about that. As like the figure of the zombie itself, and this is something which the 21st century kind of served back to us, if you like, and by us I mean comic readers, basically. You can extend it to gamers now, nerds of any stripe, even the mighty nerd of Silicon Valley. The zombie is that thing which we can comfort ourselves by not being, because, like you say, we're on the right side of the wall. We're successfully developing the outgroup with our superior cultural taste, as it was in the good old days when we were young people reading comics. And it's kind of developed to a point where the comfort of superior cultural taste isn't enough, because it's just the culture now. And so you're kind of faced with the fact that maybe you're not a zombie anymore. You're not a zombie anymore, and that that kind of security of being on the right side of the wall is one which we're constantly struggling to define ourselves against. It's like where do we stand? What side of the wall are we on?
Bobsy, I think that's a beautiful note to end on.
Dude, I'm pleased to be able to help.
I had all these notes. Hey man, there was all this stuff we were going to get into about Haitian zombies. I'm just throwing it out the window. Let's just end on that.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, we've kind of slowed down doing the Shadow Trap a little bit, and we're just doing it on like high days and holidays now. Yeah. And the next one's probably going to be Halloween, and I've got notes about Haitian zombies. I've got notes about fast zombies as opposed to slow zombies, and all of that is, well, I'm going to have to talk to Rosie about it, but it's probably going into my next podcast. Looking forward to it.
For those listening, Bobsy and Rosie, who do the Shadow Trap, they pick source texts to riff on when they're talking about the trap that they're trying to prepare. Like what kind of content gives you the information you need to know about the target you're hunting. Can I suggest one for running zombies?
Running zombies. Okay, that's interesting because that limits. That doesn't help me with my Haitian zombies notes. But
this one's interesting. Maybe just general as a contrast. Have you watched The Kingdom?
No. What's that?
It's a Korean zombie show. It's on Netflix.
All right.
They took the historical events of a plague that happened to coincide with the dynasty struggle, and they've replaced the plague with zombies.
Oh.
And yes, and in the show, the zombies sleep during the day and they activate at night, and they can run and they can pursue and they can, their main focus is infection. That's their main approach. They're not eating. They eat, but they don't eat entirely. They won't stop to eat. They'll just keep going.
Right.
And
okay.
It's the showmaker's way of illustrating the passage of a disease.
Ah, okay. This sounds great.
And it's really good. It's a very inventive use as the zombie as metaphor, which was always the attraction of the zombie to me. It's the reason why I became so frustrated with The Walking Dead, because I realized there was no metaphor beyond a subconscious one. And it's historical drama that happens to be a historical drama with zombies.
Bro, that sounds amazing. Emmet, thank you for the recommendation. The last zombie thing I saw, which kind of like made me go, oh yeah, was Last Train to Busan. That's Korean too, right?
That's amazing. Yeah. And the sequel's coming out soon.
Oh, really? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Let's look east for your new zombie metaphors, guys.
Bobsy, thank you so much. That was great. I really appreciate that.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you ever so much for having me on. It's been really good fun to chat to you.
Very good.
The Walking Dead is published by Image. Let us know what you think. Email us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com. Tweet us at deconcomics, like our Facebook page, or join our active Facebook group. We'd also really appreciate your supporting us with a pledge on Patreon. Our tiers start at just $2 a month. Pledge at least $4 a month to get our Patreon-only series Spider-Man 1963 and Tim Catches Up with the MCU, where this weekend we'll publish our review of Ant-Man. Go to patreon.com/deconcomics to join the fun. Also, please help us get noticed by reviewing us on Apple or any other podcast source. Do your shopping at deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon so that we get a percentage of the sale. And share our episodes on your social media. We appreciate your support in bringing Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and To the Batpoles to a larger audience. Our theme is from bensound.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. Mulele and I will be here next Wednesday to talk about the series Collapse and Evil Witch Alley. And in 2 weeks on Deconstructing Comics, we'll begin a 2-part interview with Dan Mishkin, co-creator of the 80s DC series Amethyst and Blue Devil, and the writer of the Warren Commission Report, a graphic investigation. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.